Welcome to Season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, then you're in the right place. I'm Sam Bilton, an author of some rather niche books who adores her history and food. And by the end of this podcast, I hope you'll be a fan of food history too. You can see what historical delicacies I'm cooking at the moment on Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. In Season 4, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the fascinating world of fresh water, which as we all know is vital to life. We'll be journeying through the centuries to learn more about the food, drink and medicines water provides, its spiritual significance, discovering how water has been used to prepare and preserve our victuals, and how water has been utilised as a source of power and transportation for the food sector. Some of the topics will be obvious, but as ever, I hope that 1 or 2 will be pleasantly surprising. As with earlier seasons of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, the guests will be invited to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And we've had some delicious contributions, I can tell you. The paid subscribers to the Comfortably Hungry Substack will also get access to recipes inspired by the topics covered in this season. For centuries, alchemists searched for the elixir of life, a potion which could cure any ill and stave off the inevitable death that we all face. They didn't find it, of course, but further down the line, the legacy of these early pharmacological experiments would be the formation of our modern distilling industry. In the medieval and early modern period, the study of alchemy was deemed to be the preserve of men. That's not to say that women didn't practice a sort of alchemy in the domestic environment, where they were involved in the distilling of waters and cordials, largely alcoholic concoctions, not to be confused with modern-day fruit squashes. In his 1615 Guide for Housewives, Jervis Markham advises his reader to furnish herself of very good stills, and in them she shall distill all sorts of waters meet for the health of her household. Lady Grace Mildmay, who lived between 1552 and 1620, kept detailed records of the waters she distilled, which included a recipe for potable gold that she claimed was wonderful good to stay all manner of the bloody flux and subtle humours. Nor was Lady Grace an outlier. If you look at handwritten household manuscripts from this period and into the 18th century, you'll find recipes for medicinal waters and cordials mingled in with those for pies and potages. Chief among these potions was aqua vitae, or water of life, a general all-purpose prophylactic, although it stopped short of imbuing the imbiber with immortality. One of Markham's aqua vitae recipes includes a long list of herbs including marjoram, white wormwood, and pennyroyal and spices steeped in ale and sack lees, the dead yeast cells and other sediment left after the fermentation of sherry. Other versions of aqua vitae use wine as the base. This complex mixture was distilled before being mixed with water and rosa solis, along with ingredients such as dates, sugar, crushed pearls and gold leaf. It was then bottled and left in the sun for a month or 2 before use. According to Markham, its virtues were infinite. Rosa solis, in case you were wondering, was another water distilled from the plant Drosera rotundifolia, or sundew, widely regarded in Elizabeth I's reign as an aphrodisiac on account of making sheep and cattle rather randy if they ate too much of it. English women were not alone in their distilling endeavours. During the same period in Ireland and Scotland, women were involved in the distillation of their own version of the water of life, known as usquebaugh. Women like Bessie Campbell, who in 1596 was ordered to desist from making usquebaugh or face imprisonment. Usquebaugh would give way to a malted barley liquor that we recognise today as whisky, but women's role in its production over history has largely been overlooked. To help remedy that situation, I am joined by Peter Gilchrist, food historian and host of the Scottish Food History podcast, who you can also find at the Tenement Kitchen. Peter appeared on this podcast in season 3 with Dr. Lindsay Middleton to chat to me about black bun. Peter and I are joined by Rosalind Erskine, food and drink editor of the Scotsman and host of the Scran podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Peter and Rosalind. Now, Rosalind, this is your first time on the Comfortably Hungry podcast, so can you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm Rosalind Erskine. I'm the food and drink editor for the Scotsman newspaper, and I am the host of their Scran podcast, which Peter, who's also on this podcast, has been a guest multiple times. So it's a podcast about Scottish food and drink, covering everything from chefs and restaurants to farming to whisky as well.
Which is handy for today.
Yeah, yeah.
And Peter, how have you been? You've been busy, I see. I've been particularly enjoying your reels on getting pissed with our ancestors.
Yeah, I need to start that back up. I finished that just at the end of last year, and I'm waiting for the first weeds to push through the earth before I can start getting pissed with my ancestors again. But yeah, it's been a busy. We're currently at the beginning of February, so January is the busiest month for any Scottish food historian, with burns and hogmanay and all sorts. So yeah, I feel like I'm ready to get back into my own work, having spent the last 4 weeks reciting poetry and carving haggis.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's good fun at the time, but it's a bit like English food historians and mince pies and plum pudding at the run up to Christmas.
Exactly.
Well, it's good to have you back, and we're going to be talking about a subject which I have to confess I don't know much about. So I've been reading about the English versions of aquavitae, and I believe in Scotland this is called... Peter, I'm going to get you to say the word because I know I'm going to absolutely murder it.
The Gaelic word is usquebaugh.
Usquebaugh, which sounds much better than the way I would have pronounced it. So usquebaugh. So that's brilliant. So how did it differ much from the English versions of aquavitae? Do we know?
I think what we can assume is that they're using things like barley, like beer. They're going to use the resources which are on hand. We believe that kind of the early distilling in Scotland was carried out by monks, which is not a surprise because abbeys were kind of centres for herbal medicine, for culinary techniques, for herbology, and the early records we have, I believe, are 15th century, 16th century. Yeah, these kind of monks are developing, amongst other tonics and medicines of the time, whisky. Usquebaugh begins to emerge from abbeys.
Ros, is there anything you'd like to add to that about its origins and how it may have differed?
No, not really. I think Peter's right. It would have been what's available. So it was the very, very modern version of what we know whisky in Scotland today, which would be malted barley, water and yeast. Whereas I think aquavitae was cereals, like different cereals. So I think that would be the main kind of point of difference.
And so when did distilling really take off in Scotland?
So there was a lot of illegal distillation going on for a long time, but I think it really took off and kind of became mainstream after the Excise Act, which was 1823. So a lot of distilleries in the last few years were celebrating their 200th anniversary because they may have been making whisky before that, but that's when the Excise Act came in, and they then started paying taxes and became like functioning businesses. So the cottage industry of, a little croft with a still just became fewer and fewer because they became established big businesses that, were having to pay tax.
Yeah. And we'll come back to that in a little while. But in England, certainly, aquavitaes were, I guess they were marketed, for want of a better description, as a medicinal cure. Was there any point in Scottish history where they would have been seen as something medicinal rather than something we drink for pleasure?
Absolutely. I think there was less of a line between medicine and drinking for pleasure back then. I've done some historic kind of tonics and bitters and things, and they all are 90% alcohol with different herbs and spices and things thrown into them to have some sort of positive impact probably on your humours. But no, certainly I think that the bit that's missing in between there is actually the folklore. But you might think about what we might think about today as spiritual. It was something that was sacred in communities. So it really blends that line between drinking for pleasure, drinking as a community, and drinking because it's what connects you in a way with your folklore beliefs.
Yeah, because these drinks were served at various, I suppose, life stage events, weren't they? They played quite an important role in that, I gather. Things like funerals and christenings and weddings as well, which I guess is no great surprise because we love a drink at all those events even today.
No, absolutely. When we're looking at the 1600s, really, where whiskey moves from being perhaps something which a few skilled individuals are doing that might be making, from the abbeys to people that have power and are well connected and making whiskey bottles for their fancy affluent friends and for monarchs. And then when they begin to roll out an initial tax on Scotch, on whiskey, on finished whiskey, that's where we see home stills becoming more common. And that's where we see the role of whiskey moving away from the elite or from abbeys and monasteries through to the home, the cottage kitchen. And making whiskey became something that was part of a woman's daily chore. And at this time, if you think about Scotland in the 16 and 1700s, what you're seeing is people that live in very tight communities, and you're very reliant on each other to make it through winter, to if you have famine, if you have a bad harvest, if you have disease, if you have the pest that comes in, communities are galvanized around survival. And so we see community events and festivals and feasts, and these life moments are celebrated as community rights. And if you were a woman who had a marriage coming up, or probably not birthdays, I would say, but definitely funerals, your quarter days, like Samhain, like Halloween, Christmas, Imbolc on February 2nd, these community festivals, if you were participating, you had to make enough whiskey for everyone in your community to drink until they wanted to stop. And if the bottles ran dry, then it was a source of immense shame. It was one of these things that you had to be able to provide this, not just for everyone to get a bit pissed, but it's that little community spiritual connection of this is the thing this is what we do, this is what connects us, this is what we do in our sacred days. And if you don't have it, then no whiskey, no party.
Well, I mean, I can't say they were wrong in many ways. So, I mean, what evidence do we have of the women being involved? Because is this? I mean, it's not unusual because I've already said this in the introduction, haven't I? Women were responsible for managing sort of the household, and that included brewing the medicinal waters or the drinks in this case. But what documentary evidence is there?
We don't have a lot of documentation about women's roles in the home because it was so pedestrian, and often what we were kind of maybe studying from the beginning, end of the 1700s, we begin to see some statistical accounts of what people are eating, but not necessarily what people are drinking, because it didn't seem like it was a very important aspect of peasant life. What you really wanted to know is how much meat are you having, how much grain are you having, how much cheese are you having? And outside of that, you're not really looking at things like medicine and, of course, like whiskey. And by that point, by the time we get around to statistical accounts, home stilling really has died as an art form, and it really has moved over into, by this time, illicit distilling. And, of course, in the kind of central belt, heavily taxed whiskey making, which I'm sure we'll come on to next.
Yeah, and I think actually something that I noted when I was sort of reading around this topic is that, Ros, you'll have to correct me if I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but I think historically whiskey was seen as something that was drunk by the working classes. It wasn't seen as a luxurious drink particularly. Am I correct in that?
My understanding was, yeah, if it's like a home, like what Peter's talking about, the sort of like croft industry, when you're making it at home like that, it's been drunk by everyone. Yeah. When it comes into more prominence of what it is now, it was actually the king at the time of the Excise Act, who, Peter, again, you'll have to help me with this, I think it was King George. He wanted Speyside whiskey, and so it was then being drunk by royalty. But that's when you start to come into like the single malt, and you know it's maybe been in barrel, so it tastes a bit better than like the moonshine would have done. So yeah, it starts off something for everyone, and then it kind of goes up the echelons of society as you go on through, you know, hundreds of years.
It definitely starts as something which is for the elite, because we have to remember you need to have a still, which is an expensive piece of equipment, because it has to be, you know, the technology in itself is not something that was available for everyone. I'm sure there are ways of distilling at home using multiple pots and layers, but that's not something necessarily that you're going to do in a cottage over an open fire. It really is when we begin to have home stills manufactured that people are able to create it with some level of accuracy, because again, distilling is dangerous. You could make a bottle that blinds you or kill someone. So it was definitely something that began as the elites. Once we have home stills become more affordable, it then really moves into the cottages. And what you have to remember, you know, we're talking about the span of hundreds of years, and the perspective on whiskey changes, the trends of whiskey changes. You'll have family recipes. You know, Janet from Achtermuchty does a really great usquebaugh. I wouldn't touch Janice's because she always leaves it on. You know, there's a real fluidity to whiskey making, and it's not until we get much further down to the kind of late 1700s, early 1800s that whiskey really becomes what we know of it today, where there's a standardized process, there's timings, there's heat, there's temperature. You know, the skill and the craft of whiskey making comes much later.
Peter, you already sort of said that it was the women that were predominantly making these home brews. We talk about the home brews before it sort of becomes more commercial, if you like. What sort of women were undertaking this role, and how were they viewed? Because I don't know whether this is utter rubbish, but I did read in one book that they were, in certain periods in the past, they may have been viewed as witches or being involved in some kind of nefarious goings on. I like to say, I don't know whether this is wholly true or not, because I couldn't find anything in any academic text that backed that particular claim up.
No. But it would not surprise me. I think it's very likely, mostly to do because of how prevalent whiskey making was. So what we have to understand is that whiskey was like currency in Scotland. So you could pay farm workers, you could barter for your rent, you could exchange it for goods and services. So, and it was probably as like prevalent as who women in the 1940s making scones. Did every woman in the 1940s make scones? Probably at some point. Did they all have their own recipes? Did they all do that? You know, that's what it was like in the home. It wasn't necessarily something that was like a rare skill. It was something that most women did. If a woman made a really good whiskey, she had power. She could have power over her community. She could withhold whiskey. She could begin to control her local economy if she was a really great whiskey maker who understood the craft and could churn out bottles every week. Now, what we know now about the witch trials, and what we know now about how the position of women in Scotland was impacted by communities essentially turning on powerful women as a way to take property, you know, return power into men's hands. There's what we know now about the witch culture. It does not surprise me at all that we would have records of women who were whiskey makers who were accused of being witches. And as well, I mean, you know, women that were really good whiskey makers were probably also really good at making, you know, medicines, probably had an understanding of herbology, may have also, you know, understood the properties of, you know, understanding the properties of alcohol as a disinfectant. There was probably a lot that happened in there that would have been construed as maybe a supernatural understanding.
You know, over the centuries, there's been various attempts to control the distilling, hasn't there, in the domestic environment? When do the authorities start sort of clamping down? And I'm guessing it was the English.
So in the 1600s, you have the malt tax in England. Now that does have an impact in England because, like, beer and their own alcohol, their own bread making, malt tax does have an impact in England. When we have in 1707, when we have the beginning of the coming together as Scotland and England, they're essentially looking to just roll out English laws across Scotland. But we have a distinct economy and we have a distinct civilization, which, remembering, used whisky as currency. When they roll out the malt tax in I think it's 1725, you then have women who have been used to paying for rent and paying for services and goods with whisky cannot afford to buy malt.
Okay.
And we then have the kind of the excise men who are essentially taxmen, and they're going around the country and they're investigating illegal distilling. And they are allowed to come into your home, search your property. If there's rumours of distilling, if you have a still at home, you can destroy it then and there. Most historic stills that we have are broken and punctured because excise men were touring the country breaking them. You could see imprisonment. You could have if you were using your cart or a boat to move your illegal, that could be confiscated as well. So it really overnight drastically changed the Highland economy. We're just kind of on the tip of the Highland clearances as well. So I definitely think there was other forces at work here that crippled essentially an entire, kind of region of Scotland. So at that time, what you have is a malt tax. And so your distilleries that are kind of on the central belt of Scotland, they don't really have an option to get away with anything because there's nowhere to hide. So they're just paying more for their bottling and creating whiskey during this time. But what they'd start doing is reusing their malt, and what you get is a poorer product because they're trying to maximise profit here. Now, in the Highlands, where you have big, wide open spaces and kind of lots of sneaky places and caves and valleys to hide in, people begin to take distilling underground. And so you have excise men that are travelling the breadth of Scotland, and communities begin to, again, become galvanised around whisky. They have secret codes, smoke signals. If you're up on a hill and you've got a washing line, you would hang out certain sheets if the excise men were coming.
Oh, okay.
There was horns that would be blasted through the glens to warn everyone. People would pretend that they didn't speak English and just speak in Gaelic, and to try and baffle and hold back the excise men for as long as possible. And inside of that, you have these kind of working class heroes of these distillers. It was certainly, I would say, a man's field of work now because of the nature of illicit distilling, the repercussions of imprisonment, of fining, of confiscation of your livelihood. It was certainly men that took over this now. But entire communities were in on it.
So there isn't a record of women being arrested in this. It is by, as you say, by now the men are taking the risk, are they? Or there's not. We don't know that women are getting arrested for the distilling, illicit distilling. Sure.
No, I haven't found any. Doesn't mean they're not there, but it certainly we have much more records. The records that we have are all men, but again, communities were involved, so women were certainly in there, and I definitely think that the family recipes that Janice from Auchtermuckety's whiskey was the beginning of the next, and then it was developed by these distillers. What happens in this time where these illicit distillers are distilling whiskey is that they have the time to really develop the flavours of whiskey, that the craft of whiskey is really standardised at this time, and the kind of stillmen become kind of sought after personalities that people want to have making their whiskey. And that's throughout this time, the people are essentially bottling whiskey. Some are putting it in coffins to move it across the country. You're putting it in boats. You're hiding it in caves. There's signals. It becomes a real part of this rebellion culture in the Highlands. But a lot of this is probably motivated because we're not that kind of far after kind of the Jacobite Rebellion and the prescription of Highland dress. You know, whiskey becomes one of the last remnants of rebellion in the Highlands for lots of communities who can't wear tartan, who can't engage as their old clan systems. This becomes that last shred of quiet resistance to the powers that be.
Something that's occurred to me is, and I have to confess, I'm not a whiskey drinker. I have been on whiskey tastings before and I do enjoy it, but it's just not something I drink particularly. Is it like they do with wine? Is there a certain degree of terroir, if I can use that word, that affects the flavour of whiskey? Now, I'm talking about even modern day whiskey now. Peter's already alluded to the fact that some of these distillers, the male distillers, were particularly sought after for their skill at blending the flavours.
So I would say this is an interesting question that still has some debate around it now. There's people in the whiskey industry now that don't really think terroir is a huge thing, like wine. And there's some people who would argue that it is. A lot of the whiskey is like we said, it's malted barley, it's yeast and it's water. Back hundreds of years ago, and Peter, again, correct me if I'm wrong, there wouldn't be the maturation in cask, or if there was, it's not being done in the same way now. It would be because it's getting moved. So things are stored in casks. The new make spirit, as it would be, it would be clear, it would be really strong. If it gets put in a cask, it's because it's getting moved. It's not because anyone's really aware of what that's going to do to the flavour at that time. Now, obviously, they do know, but I would say, there's some whiskey distilleries now that will say, you'll get the salinity of the sea because we're on an island. And you might get that, I just think it's all very subjective. I think with wine, because the vines are living things in the soil and they're growing the grapes, obviously. Barley, once it's grown, I mean, you've different strains of barley give certain slight flavour changes, but I don't think it's the same as grapes for wine. And I think you could have this conversation for a long time with lots of different people who have lots of different ideas. But ultimately for me, it's the flavour coming from the cask. It's your new make spirit has its flavour based on the cut points, based on your still shape, and you take that as your base, but then it's the cask and it's the blending of the different casks into your final product.
And another question that suddenly occurred to me while we've been chatting is, we had barley in England, so why don't we have English whiskey?
At this, historically?
Or now, or do we? I mean, I'm not aware of any, but I like drinking. I don't write about drink, I should say. I'm not a drink expert in that regard. But so we may have English whiskey, and if anyone wants to write in or email me and tell me about it, please do.
You do have English whiskey. You've got English whiskey now. There's a lot more than there used to be. There's a huge influence from Scotch, but English whiskey doesn't have the same very strict laws around it. So a Scotch obviously has to be malted barley, watered and yeast. It's got to be matured in Scotland in oak barrels for at least 3 years. English whiskey could be any kind of grain, it could be any kind of wood that it's matured in.
Oh, wow.
Lots of different English distilleries could come together to create something. And they wanted to be able to call that a single malt. They're not allowed to call that a single malt because a single malt should come from one singular distillery because that's what Scotch adheres to. There's a bit of a falling out between the Scotch Whisky Association and English whisky, I think about a year ago. No, but English whiskies, it's interesting. It's quite young. It's vibrant. It's different because you don't have those rules. But I just think Scotch, with its history and its standing in the world, it's always going to be the one that's up here because of the history. And I actually think the rules, as much as they can be restrictive, it puts in place a level of quality that isn't really seen in English whiskey right now. Not to say that it's bad, it's just different.
No, that's fair enough. I every day's a school day as far as I'm concerned. I had no idea we even made it. And I don't think historically, Peter, you may know the answer to this. Historically, we don't have a history of making whiskey in England. I know if we're talking about the United Kingdom, obviously that's different. But England itself isn't. We've never had a history, to my knowledge, of making whiskey. Aquavite, yeah, but not what we would identify as whiskey today.
I think what you don't have is the industry. which is very different. I
True.
think that when we're talking about why does Scotland use barley, I think it's just because we can grow it so well up here.
Okay,
And
yeah.
you can grow other grains far better where you have a much drier growing season, a much shorter season with lots of bright light. Wheat loves that. We have very wet, dark, summers, and barley loves that, and it loves to drink up water, and it does very well in our kind of highland jaggy rocks. So I think it's just what the resources that are on hand is what creates whatever the people of that civilization eat and drink. And so barley obviously is much more popular here. I think beer is definitely something that I would associate more with England. Of course, we had it here too, but when I think about that, the industry, the culture that surrounded it, I think beer was much stronger with England, and definitely whiskey took over that place of that, like that thin line between community, spirituality, function, and folklore.
Yeah. And is it only barley that is used in Scotland, or has any other grain been used, like oats or rye, for example?
Yeah, so to call it a Scotch, it's got to be malted barley. You can get grain whiskey, which it's sweeter. Like there's something in it that's still whiskey, but it's like...
Yeah, made from grains like wheat, maize, rye, barley, and sometimes oats or rice.
Would that be a single grain?
That's your a grain whiskey can be made from wheat, maize, corn, rye, barley, sometimes oats or rice. I don't think rice was used in Scotland.
No.
No, I don't think so.
So I'm completely digressing here. Is that what they make Japanese whiskey from? Is that made from rice, do you know? Or is that made from... I've never actually thought about... I know that's coming, from what I've read, it's coming up in the world, or has been coming up in the world in recent years. How do they make it in Japan? Do they use rice?
I don't know. Well, Japanese, like rice wine is perhaps more what I would associate with a kind of alcohol made from rice. I don't actually know that much about foreign whiskies.
It was, I'm sorry if I murdered this pronunciation, it was Mazatake Takesura, who studied in Glasgow and went to Longmorn and Hazelburn, once in Speyside, once in Campbelltown. And he's known as the father of Japanese whiskey. So Japanese whiskey is actually really heavily influenced by Scotch. So it is malted barley, and it does have quite a relatively long, not as long as Scotch history.
What we're talking about here perhaps is brand Scotland, and countries that see the value in the history, the heritage, illicit distilling, moonshining, all these stories, the Jacobites, Sir Walter Scott. And so, we actually have now, I'm sure Rosalind can add to this, but, you have countries like India, China, Japan, you have distilleries in Africa, you have, people are wanting to take a bit of that heritage and imbue their own culture onto it, which is very exciting, because I think we're at the forefront of that conversation. People are learning from us all around the world. We have such a unique selling point that sometimes when I just got sent a whiskey from an Indian distillery, which I'm looking forward to trying, and there's a wee bit of it which is like, this is a little bit of us. There's a little bit of our story that's now being pulled by another culture that are going to now do something completely different with it. I think that's very exciting.
Well, I'm guessing that's what happened in the States originally with the immigration over there, was it? When you had Scots and Irish emigrating to America and setting up distillery and using, I don't, is it rye? I don't see. I really am showing my ignorance.
No, but people are when people are going over to, really, I think more about places like Appalachia, the kind of Blue Ridge Mountains and communities, because there's we know more about them because the food culture was preserved for much longer, because they were slightly more isolated than perhaps ships that went to more popular cities, Boston or, Nova Scotia and things like that. But they took over lots of their food culture, so oats and barley and bear meal and bannocks and whiskey making. Because at the time, you can probably track it from the point of people immigrating who were home distillers who took away that technology and the ability and the recipes and things. And then the people who perhaps immigrated a wee bit later on perhaps aren't bringing with them the skills of distilling, because it's been illicit there. You might have a few people who do know how to distill whiskey going over, and then it becomes something that is taught over there. But no, I definitely think when you're looking at perhaps in the south, you begin to see that whisky culture, which funnily enough, I think still over there in the south, does that fine line between community folklore, spirituality. It's something which is intrinsic to their culture and sense of identity, like
Yeah.
it was in Scotland. The earliest kind of immigrants from definitely Ireland and Scotland, well, and we share lots of our history with Ireland, but the settlers, the people that were leaving perhaps to colonise or being driven out of their countries, took with them that skills and that reverence, and probably, I would say, definitely had to use what was over there and on top of what they'd already grown. So you'll probably find, more of those like the rye whiskies and the kind of using maize and things as well. It probably wasn't as strict as we have over here of a single malt Scotch.
Okay. Well, I've learnt loads already. So let's get back on track, because I should say I've sent my wonderful guest questions and I've gone completely off piece, which is very remiss of me. When do the first legal female distillers start operating? Because they don't disappear completely, do they? In terms of women's role in distilling. I'm thinking now sort of in the 19th century.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we have the first license we have is Helen Cumming, who in 1824 got a license. And then there is a kind of the story of the Ardberg, the McDougall sisters, Margaret and Flora, who had a license in the 1850s.
And would they have been very prominent, or are they sort of, are we celebrating them now in light of the fact that obviously we're sort of championing women generally in business? At the time, do you think their involvement would have been recognised or known about?
I think so, yeah. I mean, Elizabeth Cumming was running Cardew Distillery because a lot of what happened was they were widows, so her husband died, and then her daughter-in-law helped her take over because the son died, and so they were the owners of that business, and that then got sold to Johnny Walker. And with Ardbeg, they would have been recognised as the people running those businesses. They just happened to be women.
I think, like you were saying, it's not, perhaps it's such a delicate time for a woman in power in the 19th century, where I think because she was made a widow, she wasn't perhaps painted in a way that other women might have been if they had tried to set up a distillery.
Right.
In the, like, she took on the responsibility, she kept people employed, and that's very different. I don't think we can say that whiskey making was a really friendly place for women. That women were an important part of that network. I think that there were women who made enterprise happen, who stepped in to fill a gap, and who were fantastic at it. But no, I think you still have and to this day, I think you still have a very male-focused sector of whiskey, whether it's the craft of making of whiskey, the selling of whiskey. It's not necessarily seen as a women's role, and hasn't been really in Scottish history from the point that it leaves the cottage kitchen, and it leaves being a women's role through to illicit distilling.
But women are involved in it now, aren't they? It makes it sound like they're distilling from home, but they're, actively involved in the business.
Yeah, and there were women like from that sort of early 19th century onwards. I mean, Bessie Williamson was the first manager and female owner of Lefroy, and she started as a secretary and worked her way up. So she's really celebrated.
What period is that? Are we talking sort of later 19th century or in the 20th?
Yeah, sort of like 50s, 1950s. So like, again, at a time whereby you might not expect that. And then there's been records of female coppersmiths, helping repair the stills in Campbelltown. Again, as Peter said, that's a kind of small, quite remote community. So they've been there. You just maybe don't really hear about them as much until, maybe more modern times, whereby it's part of a very well-established brand's history and they want to celebrate that, quite rightly so. So, yeah, and there's now, I mean, there's female master blenders, there's, distillery managers, there's brand ambassadors, so it's very much well split, I would say.
Good. Well, I'm pleased to hear it. And I understand that Beyonce even has a brand of whiskey these days.
It's a rye whiskey that's distilled in America, in Kentucky, I think. But the company behind it's LVMH, so Glenmorangie. So it was their head of whiskey creation, Dr. Bill Lumsden, who came up with the malt bill and the recipe for her. So there is a slight Scottish connection there, but it is an American rye. It's very nice as well.
A loaded question for you both. Where's the best whiskey in the world from?
Obviously Scotland.
Do you have a favourite, the pair of you?
I'm really new to my whiskey journey. And really the only reason I've been getting into it is because people keep sending me whiskies to try. And I have now thought, right, I really need to start getting into this.
I'm obviously in the wrong industry, Peter, because I never get whiskey to try.
I am sure at the end of the publishing of this podcast where you're celebrating whiskey, you'll get a few emails to say, could we send you a whiskey? But I've just been making, M&S sent me all their whiskies. So I've been been drinking a Glenfarclas 10 years Highland single malt Scotch whiskey. I have to say, I really enjoyed this one. I'm not quite at a neat or an over rocks. I'm using it in cocktails or in highballs, but I have really enjoyed it. The first cocktail I made with it was a turnip tonic and sherry cocktail, which was turnip tonic. So yeah, it's a tonic company in Scotland.
Oh, it's actually a thing. It's not something you've made yourself.
It's really nice.
It is. So this is Walter Gregor's tonic water. It's got Scottish neat with quin. It's what I say to people is it's very much like a vermouth, like a sweet vermouth. It's got that kind of all the kind of the herbal notes, that kind of fortified vegetal flavour that comes in. It goes really well with Pedro Jimenez sherry, a nice dark
sherry,
sweet sherry, which goes really nicely with the whiskey as well. A wee squeeze of fresh orange. A wee squeeze of an orange just to balance out and add some fruitiness. Lovely. And a wee rind. Delicious.
I should say as well that whiskey cocktails are becoming really popular, very accepted. There was a time not that long ago whereby it was considered sacrilege to put a single malt in anything other than a tumbler with a bit of ice. And even then, the ice was... but no, it's become really, really accepted and a really sort of fun way to just diversify who's drinking whiskey, because it's been seen as such a kind of old man's drink for so long. To get like a younger market involved, you have to kind of go down the cocktail route. And it's, if you're buying a bottle of whiskey, it's up to you what you do with it. And if that whiskey, like Peter, if you like Glenfarclas in a cocktail and then it gets you drinking more Glenfarclas, they're happy because you're then, a consumer of their product. And it is a very good whiskey, by the way. So my favourite would depend sort of on the time of year, like how I'm feeling. Right now, it's probably a much more peaty whiskey because it's really cold and they're quite warming. I like a Lefroy 16. Our Big 10's nice. In the summer, maybe something a bit lighter from Speyside. Glenmurray's really good. And Ben Romack 15 is really nice mix of ever so slightly smoky but not too overpowering.
Nice.
That's someone who knows whiskey.
Yeah, that is someone who knows whiskey. I'm definitely going to have to brush up on my whiskey tasting going forward.
This is a public announcement for all distilleries that want to have Sam Bilton out for a big whiskey tour.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ros, what will you be bringing to our season's potluck supper then?
So I had to rethink about this, and one of the things I make a lot at this time of year that everyone seems to really like is a smoked fish and leek pie, but all in pastry. So you can slice it up and have it
nice.
Like on a wee plate, so you don't have to worry too much about mess. It is very good. It's got lots of fried potato in it as well, which I think is what makes it so nice.
Oh yeah. Yeah, double carbs, always a winner as far as I'm concerned. That sounds wonderful. And Peter, how about yourself?
So I'm going to bring, it's more of a serving suggestion than a dish, but it's a highly spiced, moist gingerbread cake and then smoked Orkney cheese on top, maybe a little bit of butter. It is the most delicious combination that you will ever try, but especially if you've got a smoky whiskey sitting next to it, it pairs incredibly well. And because you get a wee bit of that sharpness and the heat from a really good, maybe a gingerbread that has maybe some crystallized ginger in it, It's like a fantastic,
Nice.
it kind of like helps to like add a bit of heat that's needed, I think, sometimes if you're having a nice neat over ice whiskey or a light whiskey cocktail.
And what would the cheese be? You said it's smoked Orkney cheese. Does it have is there a particular one?
I mean, I think any good Scottish smoked or well-aged cheese goes well with the ginger. I say Orkney because I just had a smoked Orkney cheese in my fridge, which is now finished, and I can look through the bin for the wrapper from the company.
Don't need it. You don't need to do that. Sure, people can Google it.
Google smoked Orkney cheese. Actually, and there's a really nice Orkney cheese, which is a cheddar, which has black pepper through it, which is again a wee bit spicy, and I think a really nice addition to a gingerbread.
Yeah, well, you kind of had me at gingerbread. Let's face it. You know, I have a particular penchant for gingerbread.
I know who I'm talking to, Sam.
Exactly. But I have to say, I've tried it with cheese. Big fan of gingerbread and cheese. Never paired it with whiskey, but I'll have to do that when I get my samples through from the distilleries that are obviously going to be listening to this podcast.
When you come up for the Rosalind, Peter, Sam tour of distilleries around Scotland, our BBC Two road trip,
it's a date, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've just got to sell that one to the BBC. Anyway, thank you both for being on the podcast, and it's been hugely interesting. I've learned loads, as my listeners will gather. I am a complete whiskey novice, but I know a lot more about the history of whiskey now. And I think I may need to do a follow-up session on whiskey tasting. I feel that would be a good idea. So thank you both.
That'd be lovely. Thank you very much for having me, and it's been a great, very informative chat. So thank you.
Thank you for having us. It's been a delightful chat.
Thank you again to Peter and Rosalind for their truly eye-opening discussion today. Don't forget to check out Peter and Lindsay's Scottish Food History podcast and Rosalind's Scran podcast. You'll find links to both of those and Peter and Rosalind's social media accounts and websites in the show notes. Peter also has a hand in organising the annual Scottish Food History Symposium. Last year's event explored the history, culture and proliferation of tea in Scotland, and I was delighted to be invited to give a talk about one of my pet subjects, the history of gingerbread. You can hear my talk on the Scottish Food History podcast, along with a keynote speech by Peter Kitchen. Peter is an authority on Catherine Cranston, who revolutionised the tea room scene in Glasgow in the early 20th century, employing stylish artists like Charles Rennie Mackintosh to decorate the famous Willow Tea Room, where, incidentally, the symposium was held. Now, at the time of recording, no date had been set for the 2026 symposium, but do keep an eye on Peter's Tenement Kitchen website and social media, as I'm certain it will be announced soon, and it's definitely an event to pop in your diary if you love food history. Next time on the Comfortably Hungry podcast, I'll be finding out how the power of water can be harnessed to produce flour when I visit a watermill in Sussex. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really loved it, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, as it really will help other listeners discover Comfortably Hungry. Don't forget to pop along to sambilton.com, where you'll find details on my books, which include my latest publication, Much Ado About Cooking, written in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. This new cookbook features recipes inspired by the food in the Bard plays and was huge fun to write, so I think it will be right up your street. You may also want to subscribe to the Comfortably Hungry Substack, which includes more detailed notes from the show. You can subscribe for free, but if you become a paid subscriber for £3.50 a month, you'll also get recipes inspired by the topics covered in the show and access to extra content. Alternatively, you can leave me a one-off tip via Ko-fi to show your appreciation. Just click on the relevant link in the show notes. Your support will help fund the research required to produce Comfortably Hungry. It also means that I can avoid including those pesky ads that may interfere with your enjoyment of the podcast. If you have any questions relating to this season's theme, you can leave a comment in the chat section of the Comfortably Hungry Substack page or tag me on social media. Remember, you can find me on Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. I'll be plunging back into the liquid world of food and drink history soon, but until then, take care. Comfortably Hungry is research produced and presented by food historian Sam Bilton, with sound mixing and production by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Additional sound effects and music are provided by Zapsplat and Pom5.